Hi folks, I've got an old post-war Lionel transformer here, and we're going to do a bit of repair and restoration on it today on Eric's Trains. Alright, we're at the workbench in my garage workshop. A while back I told you guys that I'd be doing some videos about fixing up and restoring old trains. And so to that end, I recently went over to Legacy Station and brought home a box of some old Lionel post-war trains. And I picked these trains specifically because they're not in terrible shape. They don't need any major restoration work because I really don't do that type of work. What they need is basically a good cleaning and some regular maintenance work, maybe a little more, maybe some rewiring and so forth, but nothing major. So I thought that would be a good place for us to start. But anyway, I thought we'd start this series with what is the heart of any train layout, and that of course is the transformer. Now for any kids that may be watching, when I say transformer, I don't mean robots in disguise. I mean an electrical transformer, which is a device that transforms voltage from one level to another. In this case, this is a step-down transformer that takes 110 volts AC coming from the wall and steps it down to a much lower and much safer voltage that can be used to run the trains. In this case, this one has a maximum output of about 25 volts. Most modern transformers that you see have a maximum voltage of about 18 volts or so. So let's go ahead and zoom in to give us a better look. What I've got here is a Lionel Type Q 75 watt Trainmaster transformer from 1946. So this thing's going on 75 years old. Now the cover of the 1946 catalog always disturbed me a little bit. The look on that boy's face, it looks like he's about to play smash 'em up derby with those trains. I don't think I would trust him to be alone with my trains for very long. Anyway, the Type Q was only made in 1946. It did not return in 47, most likely because in 47 Lionel upgraded the power of all their transformers and 75 watts became the power rating for their smallest transformer, the 1042. The next one up was the Type A at 90 watts, and so at that point the Type Q was kind of obsolete. Now in their 1946 catalog, Lionel offered 6 transformers for sale, and going from least powerful to most powerful, the Type Q was third in line. So there were 3 more powerful options you could have, or 2 less powerful options. So for its time, the Type Q was a good middle-of-the-road transformer. Unfortunately, Lionel did not publish the prices of any of its items in the 1946 catalog, and since the Type Q only ran for that year, I'm not sure what the original price was. However, based on what I've seen in the 1947 catalog, I would guess that the original price of the Type Q was somewhere between $8 and $10, which in 2020 equates to somewhere between about 110 and 130 bucks. The Type Q was designed to run a single train with one throttle over here on the right. Although it did have 2 voltage ranges, you could do either 6 to 16 volts or 14 to 24 volts, depending on which post you used on the back. It also had a built-in circuit breaker with an overload indicator over here on the left, and you could also power a number of accessories using different post combinations on the back. We'll talk more about that later. One side note about the Type Q is that even though it was only made for 1 year, there's actually a variation that exists, and you're looking at it right now. So let me go ahead and zoom out to better explain this variation. If we take a look at the faceplate on this Type Q, you'll notice that there are 2 holes cut in the top corners, but there's nothing underneath. And to me, that seemed a little odd, especially considering that if we take a look at this Type Q that I also have in my collection, this is the more commonly seen Type Q, and it does not have those empty holes up here. So what's with that? Why does this not have those empty holes and this one does? Well, I think it has to do with the Type R transformer, Type R, which also came out in 1946. This is a Type R from my collection, and look at that, it does make use of those holes up here. It's got 2 throttles instead of 1, and then the overload indicator light and the power light. Well, here's what I think happened. The Type R continued into 1947. The Type Q did not. And so I think at some point in 1946, when Lionel realized they'd be phasing out the Type Q, to save a little money, they just used the tooling for the Type R faceplate on the Type Q, and in so doing created a variation. Pretty cool. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little history lesson on the Type Q. But this one, yeah, it's about 75 years old now, and it's in decent shape, but it does have a few issues that we need to fix in order to get it back to perfect working order. So let's turn this around and take a look at the back side. And we'll go ahead and zoom in so you can get a better view. So by using different combinations of these binding posts back here, you could get different voltages depending on what you needed to run your trains and your layout. So the throttle up front has two settings on it. If we use A and U together, and yes, that is a U, it's not a J, the U is partially rubbed off, A and U will generate 14 to 24 volts, B and U together will generate 6 to 16 volts, C and U together, although it's not listed, will give us 0 to 10 volts. And then we've got several fixed voltage settings to run accessories on the layout. So A and B together will give 8 volts, B and C together will give 6 volts, and A and C together will give 14 volts. So what this means is that you could use the variable voltage settings to run your trains. So you might use A and U to give 14 to 24 volts to your trains using the throttle on the front side. And then you could use the fixed voltage combinations to give fixed voltages to your accessories. So you might use A and C to run your street lights or maybe a motorized accessory or something like that. Now, as you can see, the nut on the U binding post is missing, so we're going to have to replace that. But the next thing I want to do is power up this Type Q and test these various binding post combinations to make sure the voltages are correct. And that brings us to our next topic, which is the power cord. So whenever you get one of these old transformers, 9 times out of 10 you're probably going to have to replace the power cord because over the years it has become dry and brittle and prone to cracking, which can present a fire and shock hazard. And in fact, on this cord right here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but the cord is cracking, thus exposing the wires. So we're going to have to replace this cord. That's par for the course, and it's normal when you're servicing one of these old transformers. But before we replace the power cord, what I'm going to do is plug this thing in very carefully, and then we're going to get a voltmeter and test the various combinations of these posts to make sure that the voltages are correct. Alright, I've got my voltmeter ready to go, so let's power up the Type Q. Now, I don't know if it's coming through in the video, but there is quite a loud buzzing noise emanating from this thing. That's okay, these old transformers will buzz, that's normal. So I've got the throttle all the way up. Let's grab our probes, and if we touch the A and U posts, we should get about 24 or 25 volts. And we do, right at 25 volts, that's good. B and U should give us about 16 volts. But look at that, there's no volts, that's not good. And C and U should give us about 10 volts, but once again, there's 0 volts. Alright, now let's try the fixed voltages. A and B should give us about 8 volts, but there's nothing. A and C should give us 14 volts, there's nothing. And B and C should give us 6 volts, but there's nothing. Wow. So really, the only thing we've got working right now is A and U, which is performing as it should. Now, just out of curiosity, I want to see if the throttle is working well. So I'm going to connect some alligator clips to these probes. And the other end to the posts. And let's throttle down. Yep. And throttle back up. So the throttle is working on AU as well. So AU is working as it should. However, the B and C terminals are not working correctly. I'm willing to bet that when we open this thing up, we're going to find that the solder lugs on the B and C posts have broken off, and we're going to have to replace the posts. One last thing I want to do before we open this thing up is test that the circuit breaker is functional. So what I'll do is create a deliberate short on A and U, and if the circuit breaker is working, the overload indicator light should come on. And it does. Yep. So to open this thing up, the first thing we're going to do is gently lift off the throttle knob, like that. And this thing's pretty dirty. We're going to give this whole thing a cleaning as we fix it. And then the next thing, I'm going to twist this bayonet bulb and remove that. Then we'll turn it over. And by the way, I did unplug this thing. You definitely want to do that before servicing these things. So there are 4 screws on the underside. So let's get those. You know, one of the nice things about old electronics is that, in contrast to a lot of modern electronics, they made these things very easy to disassemble, to open up for service reasons, because they were designed to be serviced. A lot of modern electronics are not designed that way, and they make it really hard to get in there to do any work at all. But that's not the case with these. Alright, so flip it back over. Now we're going to lift, and the plate with the posts on it will separate, and the shell should come off just like that. And there we go. So the first thing I want to do is check behind those binding posts to see if I can find out why there's no voltage getting to B and C. And oh yeah, there it is. That's what I thought it was. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but here's A, B, and C. Well, of course there's no voltage getting to B and C. There's nothing connected to those terminals at all. These solder lugs have broken off completely. Here's the solder lug for B, and here's the solder lug for C, and they're just hanging out there in space, so of course it's not working. The good news is that this is a relatively easy fix. What we're going to do is simply replace the binding posts, and then this thing will be good as new. So I'm actually glad that's all it was. But before we get to that, I want to replace the power cord, like I said, so we're going to have to remove this panel to get to that. And then while we're in here, we're going to do some general cleanup work. We'll check the condition of the circuit breaker, and we'll also check and see if any other internal wiring needs to be replaced. So to remove this plate, we've got to twist these metal tabs so that they line up with the holes. I've never been a big fan of these tabs on Lionel items, because if they break off, you can't replace them. Anyway, let's lift up. There we go. And there we go. Alright, so the power cord comes up here and is attached to these 2 solder points. So we're going to unsolder these, and we have to be careful because there's a thin wire at each solder point that goes down into the core. So we'll turn on my smoke absorber, whip out the soldering iron, and go to work. Now, it might take a while for this solder to heat up because it's been there for a long, long time. So you just have to be patient. There we go. And we'll get the other one too. There we go. Alright, now that it's loose, we can work it around these wires. And then we're going to pull it in a little bit and undo this knot. That's a strain relief knot. There we go. And now we can pull the old cord right out. Like that. So the old cord is in the trash. Here's our replacement cord. It's 6 feet long, and look at that, it even has a little L on one end. So we'll take the open end of that cord and run it through the back panel like that. And it's got to be long enough to reach those 2 solder terminals. But we want to tie that strain relief knot right about here, just like on the previous power cord. Like that. So just like with the old cable, these 2 new wires will connect to these 2 points, and I'll feed them up from the underside. So to make that a little easier, we'll bend these wires a bit just so they feed up through those holes more easily. And just like the old power cable, the plug on the new cable is non-polarized. So in this particular situation, it really doesn't matter which wire goes to which point. So we'll feed it up through the bottom. There it is. Pull it through. And fold it over. And we'll do the same with the other one. There it is. And now all we have to do is solder them in place. And by the way, the wires on the power cable were pre-tinned, so that's why I did not tin them. If they were just bare wires, I would have tinned them. It looks good, and do a little bit of cleanup and just snip the excess wire. Alright, the new power cord is good to go. Now I'm sure that some soldering purists out there are going to tell me how I did this all wrong, and that's okay. Keep in mind, I am not the world's leading expert at soldering, but this is just fine for this application. Alright, up next, while we've got that panel off, we'll do a little bit of cleanup work here. So I'm going to come in with a Scotch-Brite pad and just clean the top of the core here so that the throttle arm, the sweep arm, makes good electrical contact. And we'll come in with an air duster and blow off any dirt that may be in there. And we'll clean the sweep arm as well. And make sure we've got some good tension on there. There we go. And now we can put this panel back on. Now we'll twist these tabs to secure the panel down. Alright, up next I want to work on these binding posts. Now when I started this video I thought I would just replace these posts completely, but then I started digging around and there's a good bit of metal here, and I thought, well, maybe I can save the posts and just solder everything directly to the back of the post here with the metal that's left. But, then I started to think, I don't know if that's stable enough, and I don't know how long-term a fix that will be, just soldering to the back of the post like that. So now I'm back to where I started, where I want to replace the post. So what I'm going to do is grab my drill and drill out this area here so that the post will fall out, and then we'll put a new post in. Now the new post I'm going to use looks like this, and these are usually used in transformers like ZWs, but I think it'll work just fine here as well. One other thing is that while I was moving all this stuff around, the wire on the U-post broke off, but that's okay because I wanted to replace that wire anyway. Alright, so let's see if this will work. And by the way, I've never done this before, so this may be a complete disaster, who knows. Alright, there we go. So there's the old post. Now we'll put in the new post. So here's the new post, and it's got these teeth on one side, so it'll go in through like that, and those teeth will grip on the other side of the panel. And then on this side, there's this little nut. But before we do that, I want to put some gap-filling CA glue on the base of this post, like that. Just to make sure it holds in there nice and tight. Spray it with some fixer. And I'll also put a little down here at the base, like that. And now we'll put the nut on. And then I'm going to screw the binding post nut on the other side so that I can grab the other side with pliers. There we go. So let me show you what happened here. The new post is in. There it is on the other side. And the little nut goes on like that. And it's as good as new. So that went really well. I'm very happy with the way that turned out. So now we're going to do the same to this one. All right, these two are good to go. The third post up here, that's the A post. It's in place pretty good, although there is a little bit of corrosion here, so I'm going to leave that the way it is, but I will use a Dremel tool and a wire brush to get rid of that corrosion. There we go, that looks good. Dust it off. So now that this is all done and looking good, I'm going to start resoldering the connections, and I'll also probably replace a few of the older wires while I'm at it. Some of the wires that I want to replace go to the circuit breaker right here, so I'm going to go ahead and pop it off so that at the very least I can solder the new wires in place. But while I'm at it, I'm going to check the condition of the circuit breaker. I know it's working right now, but I want to make sure that it's good for the long term. And there's a paper gasket on top of the circuit breaker that you have to get. There we go. And there's that gasket. Alright, yeah, so it's working right now, but there's a good bit of corrosion here and here on both ends. And in fact, on this end I can see that the corrosion has already started to break the metal. It's got a crack in it. So yeah, the circuit breaker is working at the moment, but it will probably fail at some point in the future. So I went on eBay and I bought a replacement circuit breaker. So while we're replacing the wires, we'll go ahead and put the new circuit breaker in place. Alright, the new circuit breaker is ready to go, and I put a little shrink tube over here just because it kind of comes close to touching this panel and I don't want the wires to touch. So All right, believe it or not, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We are almost done. So the only thing I have to do is connect this new replacement wire to the wire going to the base of the bulb, and then we'll be done and we'll start reassembling this thing. All right, we're done with all the soldering, so I'm going to give it a blast with the air duster just to get rid of any debris that may have resulted from our work. Now we're ready to put the cover back on and reassemble this, but before we do that, I want to fire this thing up and check those voltages to make sure everything's working properly. Alright, so as before, on A and U we should have about 24 or 25 volts. And we do. Now B and U, last time we had 0 volts, so now that we've done our repair work, we should have about 16 volts or so. And look at that. That's awesome. 16.6. On C and U we should have around 9 or 10 volts. Looks good. On A and B we should have around 8 volts. And we do. And on B and C we should have about 6 volts or so. And we do. Awesome. And the last thing I want to do before we start reassembling this thing is to test that new circuit breaker. So I'm going to do a deliberate short on A and U, and that light should pop on eventually. And it does. There it is. Now on these old transformers, the circuit breaker situation is the reason that you don't want to run modern locomotives with old transformers. Any modern locomotive that has circuit boards and processors and all that stuff on board, you never want to run with these old transformers, because if they have a circuit breaker at all, the circuit breaker is not fast enough to protect modern electronics. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video. Okay, so with the transformer now in perfect operating condition, I want to focus on some restoration and cleanup work, starting with the top panel. You can see that the corner down here is a little bit cleaner than the rest, and that's because I did some experimentation down there with various methods, and I think the method I'm going to use for the faceplate is a magic eraser. It seems to be gentle enough to leave the paint unscathed, but yet with the microfiber material, it gets in there and gets rid of all the gunk and grime. So I'll go after the faceplate with the magic eraser. It's a little bit moist. Then I'll get a paper towel and get in the crevices around the faceplate, and then I'll give the rest of the case a general wipe down with either the magic eraser or some 409 or something like that. Wow, look at that. You can really tell a difference between the side I've done with the magic eraser and the side I haven't. It's a big difference. Wow. You know, this is the first time I've ever used a magic eraser to clean an old Postwar item, and I gotta say, I'm impressed. That looks fantastic. Look at that, it's even got some of its shine back. Looks fantastic now. Well, that looks worlds better in my opinion. I mean, the case looks about the same as it did, but boy, that plate looks awesome. So now, we'll set that aside, and we're gonna work on the little throttle knob. So, the first thing I'll do is spray it down with some 409, just to try to loosen up some of the gunk on the underside. And then I've got some warm soapy water here with some dish soap in it. And I've got an old toothbrush. And we're just going to scrub it down. Now, if the throttle knob was in really bad shape, if it was broken, for example, we could order a replacement on eBay or somewhere like that, but physically it's in good shape. You know, it just needs a little cleanup. It's really slippery. It's really on the interior where all the gunk gets accumulated. Nobody's ever going to see this part, but I'll know it's there, so I like to clean it up. And then I've got some rinse water here. Rinse my hands off too. And we'll use our air duster to blast out any of the water that might be down in there. Alright, that's looking almost good as new. Now with the transformer itself, there's some gunk around the edge down here, and you can't lift this piece off. It's welded on there, so I'm just going to get a paper towel and put some 409 on it and try to get down in there and get all the gunk that I can. Look at all that gunk. And we'll clean this back plate up a little bit. It's pretty clean the way it is, but take the nuts off. Okay, we're ready to put the housing back on, but I'm going to clean the screws that go into the bottom of the housing, because, you know, you'll get the whole thing clean and then you'll have these nasty looking screws. So I just like to make sure they're nice and clean. Alright, so let me pop out the bayonet bulb and we'll grab our clean housing. And the back plate here goes into two tabs at the bottom, and it folds up, and then the housing comes over the top. Kind of snaps in place. Alright, and we'll pop our bulb back in the overload indicator. Now we're gonna put the post nuts back on, but before I do that, you know, these are brand new posts. These are old, so I'm gonna clean these up with a wire brush on my Dremel tool. And I'll also clean up the old nuts before I put them on, just so they match and they're nice and clean as well. I'm using the wire brush on the Dremel tool on a very low speed because I don't want to damage these. I just want to knock off any gunk and grime. I've got some mineral spirits on a Q-tip here to clean the inside of these nuts. And by the way, I did get a replacement nut for that U-post, but it is used, so that's why I'm going to clean that up too. Looking good. Alright, so the final finishing touches, we're going to reattach our nice and clean throttle knob. There it is. And I've also ordered a little red globe on eBay to put over that overload indicator light, like that. So there it is. I'm really happy with the way this came together. It looks fantastic on the outside and it's in perfect operating condition on the inside. So let's go ahead and give it a test drive. Alright, the A and U terminals on the Type Q are connected to the track, where I've got a Lionel pre-war 249E locomotive waiting in the wings. And I've also got the A and C terminals on the Type Q connected to this street light to give it a constant 14 volts. And that's to show you how this would have worked back in the day. I've got no volts going to the track, so the trains aren't running, and yet I have a constant 14 volts going to the street lights with the same transformer. Now, for you historians of American toy trains, if this street light looks unfamiliar, I would not be surprised. This is a Soviet O-gauge streetlight. That's right, the Soviet Union did make O-gauge trains for a time. This is a teaser for a future video. Now, because the Type Q was early post-war and was not top of the line, it did not have a direction button, nor did it have a whistle button. In fact, you had to buy a separate whistle controller if you wanted to use the whistle on your locomotive, and the direction buttons were not commonplace until later. So to match the Type Q, I'm using my 249E, which this particular one does not have a reversing unit, so it only goes in one direction, and it does not have a whistle in the tender. So let's power it up and see if it runs. Looks great. Let's try it again. Looks good to me. As I said earlier, because of the nature of the circuit breakers in these older transformers, or the lack of one altogether, you would not want to use one of these older transformers with modern locomotives, because the circuit breaker, if it's there at all, is not going to be fast enough to protect modern electronics. Now, I have seen people use old transformers with modern locomotives, but to do that, you have to have a modern fast-acting circuit breaker in line between the transformer and the track to protect those modern electronics. So that being the case, in the modern world, why would you want to get one of these older transformers? Well, I can think of 3 reasons off the top of my head. First, for collecting purposes. I actually like to collect these older transformers, and actually at this time, I have almost all of the transformers that Lionel has ever made, except for a few rare ones here and there, and I've also got some American Flyer and Marks and other brands as well. Secondly, you could use these to run older trains. These are great for running anything ranging from pre-war all the way really until the mid to late 80s. And even some modern locomotives could be run with these as long as they are purely conventional and don't have any sort of digital components or computerized components on board. Now, that being said, the Type Q probably wouldn't be my first choice for running older trains because it doesn't have the direction or whistle button. If I was going to use an older transformer to run some older trains, I would probably use something like a ZW, a KW, or a TW, or something like that. A final reason you might want to pick up one of these old transformers is to use them for accessory power on your layout. And in fact, that's what I use these for. On my layout, I've got 3 or 4 old transformers similar to this one that I use to power my non-train items. So street lights, track signals, motorized items like the Lionel windmills, the Atlas oil pumps, and the Menards animated freight depot. These are fantastic for jobs like that, and you can pick them up very inexpensively. On eBay, if you find one of these that's in so-so condition that needs a little work like this one did, you might be able to get it for 10 or 15 bucks. If it's been fixed up and serviced and is in good operating condition, maybe 30 to 40 bucks. When it comes to powering accessories on your layout, that's where the Type Q and others really shine, because in this situation, less really is more. You wouldn't want to use something fancy like a ZW just to power accessories on your layout. That would be overkill, but these types are perfect in that situation. They're simple, they're reliable, you just set it and forget it. I've got some older accessory power supplies like this on my layout that I haven't laid a finger on in well over 10 years, because way back in the day I set the voltage and they've been working perfectly ever since. Anyway, that about wraps it up for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making it. As I said, this is the first in what will hopefully be a series of videos about fixing up and restoring and reviewing old trains. I think the next video will be about fixing up either a locomotive or a piece of rolling stock, so it should be fun. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd be really interested to hear your feedback. If you'd like to support Eric's Trains, I would greatly appreciate it. That can be done through Patreon at www.patreon.com/ericstrains. I'd like to put a big thank you out there to all of my current Patreon supporters. Your support means the world not only to me, but to the future of this channel, and it allows me to do videos like this. And then finally, if you'd like to buy an Eric's Trains t-shirt, check out the Eric's Trains online store at www.ericstrains.com/store. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm Eric Siegel, and I'll see you next time.